Hi everybody, Scott here. In this video I'm going to talk about INFJs and depression. Now the whole theme of depression is a very big one. So I'm going to target a specific area for this video that I think a majority of the population are susceptible to struggling with. And what I mean by that is that depression is can be seen, and it can be a chemical imbalance for some people which requires medication. And that's a reality, and that is true for some people. That is just the way it is for them. However, for a lot of people, there is an underlying cause for the depression. It's not born with it. It's not just a physiological problem. It actually has some roots in the person's life, and that's the focus of this video. I just want to also add that a lot of people have underlying issues that lead to depression and then seek help and may receive, well, I'll say a certain kind of help that leads them to being medicated. Again, some of those people, that is the appropriate way forward. For some people, it might not be, and that they end up being medicated, which might help to some degree with the depression, but it also has side effects. And I think some of these medications can have profound effects on people, and it's possible that for a lot of people, good therapy to get to the underlying issues is a better way forward. And I would say that with good therapy, the therapist should be able to help the client get to the underlying cause of the depression and help the client to resolve it in some way, so as to, in a sense, resolve the depression. Now, in this video, if you identify with the content of this video, I'd encourage you to click on my INFJ playlist, as a majority of my videos go essentially like personal growth videos for INFJs, and that kind of personal growth can help to address some depression. It may not resolve the depression, but it certainly will potentially helpful in addressing some of those issues. I don't see it as the answer, just a resource that might be of benefit to you. But of course, you also may most likely require other avenues to address your own depression. Now, it has become a bit of I guess a stereotype, but the reality is a lot of our issues in adulthood have a root and an origin in our childhood. And in a sense, the more a person ridicules that idea or scoffs at it, chances are it's more likely that for them there is something in their childhood that that they don't want to look at or they don't want to acknowledge. I've been counselling long enough to know that almost without exception, that a lot of the problems people come to counselling with have their roots in childhood. And the INFJ has their own unique challenge with their childhood. Now, I've gone into this in various ways in other videos, but just to kind of lay out the foundation to address and look at this theme of depression. So for the INFJ, if they've been brought up in a relatively healthy family environment, that they can still, depression could still end up being an issue for them, because even in a healthy family environment, the cognitive functions and the way the INFJ processes and sees the world is not understood or recognized by other members of the family. I would say it's not uncommon, or more often than not, there would only be one INFJ in a family. Of course, there's always exceptions to that, but for the most part, there's usually just one, or none. And so, part of childhood development is having our reality acknowledged and reflected back to us. An example of that is, if we're running around outside and we fall over and we skin our knee, and we're crying and we're hurting, and we go inside, and or the parent or the caregiver will hear that and come to the child and will care about that knee, will care about what's going on, will be reflecting the emotions that they're seeing, caring about the injury and caring about the child. And it's often the emotional side that is often the issue, with these sorts of things. They're hurting because of the hurt knee, if that makes sense. And when a parent takes care of the emotional side, very quickly the child will reduce in anxiety and reaction, and then they'll eventually just be able to tidy the knee up fairly quietly. And that's just an example of reflection, of mirroring. Another one is when a child comes home and they've had an exciting day, or they've had a difficult day. There's a caregiver there to ask the questions. How was your day? What happened? And engage with the child and engage with the emotional content. If there's something they're working through, the parent will help them to identify that feeling, help them to name the feeling, acknowledge that it's there, help them process it. Or if it's more positive, healthy emotion, they'll be there to sort of celebrate and join in on that emotion. And all of that is sort of acknowledging and affirming the child. The child exists, the child has feelings, the child's feelings are important, what the child is thinking, their ideas, it's all important. And some people watching this will think, well, tell me something I don't know. The reality is, for a lot of people, a lot of humans, not just INFJs, a lot of people struggle in family of origin where very little of their reality is reflected back to them. It's that whole thing of the child is seen and not heard, and sometimes they're not even seen. Now, in a healthy environment, the INFJ is probably seen and they're probably engaged with, but not necessarily is their sort of NI, if you like, or their need for harmony and that sort of thing is really recognized and taken care of. There's a danger of that, let's put it that way, when you've got other family members with a different cognitive functional stack, that we often engage with others the way we would want to be engaged too. A healthy family will recognize differences and want to accommodate those differences and allow everybody's uniqueness to exist in the family. But there is still a danger that on a deeper level, let's put it that way, that the INFJ feels missed or misunderstood, but obviously won't know it because they've sort of born into it. And it's different if a child grows up with a family and is cared for and nurtured and understood, and something happens which causes that child to move into a different family context where maybe they're not listened to, they're not cared about. There is an awareness of what it was like to be heard and recognized and understood. But when we grow up in a culture, a family culture, that is often we often sort of don't know. It's like the fish in water, doesn't know they're in it. And the other side of this is peer relationships. So a child spends a lot of time, in school, with their peers or with their teachers, and that is also an environment that can. It's not like the school environment is in some respects, not for all INFJs, but is a culture that the INFJ doesn't always feel like they fit, or it's not really designed for them. It's designed for other types of people. So the INFJ in a healthy family environment can still grow up to some extent, possibly not knowing themselves very well, and not having a lot of mirroring back to themselves in a way that really hits home for them. So they could still be mirrored to some extent, but not in that depth. And that can lead to that could lead to depression or other issues. Now, for a child growing up in an unhealthy environment, the everything that I've just shared is true for them, in the sense of being missed on a certain level and not felt known. But in the unhealthy environment, there's often some kind of more overt or covert neglect / abuse, where the child is actually being taken advantage of, or being abused in some way, or neglected in some way. And some people, one of the challenges with neglect is and abuse is sometimes the more obvious forms of abuse are more, in some respects, easier to deal with later on than the more covert neglect that it's like the absence of something as opposed to the addition of something. So if there's physical abuse, it's seen, it's obvious, it's noticeable. Whereas some more, you could almost say, narcissistic type abuse, where it can be done covertly. Again, it's like an environment that the child grows up in, and is conditioned to that environment and doesn't actually know that it's abuse. That kind of issue is a lot harder for people to identify and address. Just to put it in a different way, it's fairly obvious if someone's being hit that maybe there's an issue here, or it's if they're going to see a counsellor, it's more likely that they're going to say, oh yeah, I got hit as a child and things like that. Whereas for some people, when it's that more narcissistic covert abuse, and I am making a video on the INFJ and narcissists, so it's either coming out or it's already out, and so feel free to, I'll leave a link to that if you wanted to watch that video as well. But that more covert abuse can be harder to recognize. And so in some instances, in very unhealthy environments where codependency and dependency is encouraged, where the INFJ's FE is kind of exploited and taken advantage of, and the INFJ becomes a caretaker to those around them, and their reality is ignored. And so it's like a reversal of the way it should be. The parents should be feeding into the children and building the children up so that they can grow up and then build into their children. But what often happens is, in unhealthy family environments, is the child kind of grows up feeding the parents and feeding their unresolved issues and needs. And so there's a lot of unresolvedness and underdevelopment in the child, and they grow up and then there's a threat of them doing it themselves. There seems to be a theme that when empathy is involved, it's so if the child just has a natural empathy, it's unlikely, or they're less susceptible in some ways of growing up and re-offending in that way. It seems to be almost like a safeguard or a shield that the INFJ or anybody in that sort of situation can recognize what's going on, what it was, and not want to repeat it. But like I said, sometimes it's hard for people to recognize some forms of neglect and abuse because of its covert nature. To give another example would be the child's feelings are ignored, or they're shamed. You know, a child's feelings are, you know, if they're uncomfortable to the parent or unwelcome, they'll be shamed or put down or made fun of for their feelings, and then that child will just naturally lock those feelings down, disconnect from those feelings because of the pain associated with feeling them, through being shamed for having them. And that's just another way that these forms of neglect and abuse can occur. And all of these sorts of things can lead to depression. Other aspects that can contribute to depression and related issues is that for the INFJ, the culture of this world is very narcissistic. It's cold, it's dog eat dog, it's kind of designed in the reverse way to the way the INFJ is designed. You know, the world's built on competitiveness and getting on top of other people and pushing and shoving to get what one wants, whereas the INFJ would want to cooperate, often has no interest in that kind of approach, and will often find themselves in environments or in careers that eliminate that as much as possible. But just to make the point that INFJs are often born into a culture that doesn't support them. Whereas for maybe the SP, the SJ types, the world is more designed to cater for that sort of personality type. And I don't say that with any judgment or whatever. I think it's just a fact. Other ways that an INFJ can be sort of vulnerable to depression is that INFJs pick up the misery in this world. They feel it, they see it, they're in tune with it. And I say that is actually a positive trait, but it needs to be managed. And if, it would be wonderful for parents to be tuned into that and to help INFJs to sort of regulate that that part of themselves. So to help them in a sense to separate what they're seeing and feeling about what they're seeing versus who they are and their feelings, their reality in their inner world. I think when INFJs grow up in an unhealthy environment, there is a vulnerability of kind of enmeshment in a sense with other people's problems and issues. You know, if someone's depressed, they're depressed, when really all they're doing is picking up the other person's depression and feeling it. And if the INFJ is depressed, then maybe being around a depressed person could kind of help get them into their depression. But there's a lot to be said about developing that sense of who I am versus who they are, and what are my issues, what are my feelings versus what are their feelings, and what of their feelings am I picking up. So when a INFJ child grows up in whether it's healthy or an unhealthy family, but just grows up misunderstood and not got on a deep level, then their NI is not mirrored back to them. And a lot of what I do in counselling, particularly obviously with INFJs, is I help to mirror their NI and their inner world, to help bring light and validation to their inner world, and no matter what's going on in it. And that's ultimately what needs to happen in childhood, was when is that their NI is reflected back. And of course, as I've already highlighted, it often isn't, because if the other people in the family don't have NI in their cognitive stack, it's often overlooked or missed or misunderstood, or in more unhealthy cases, ridiculed and made fun of. So the INFJ child essentially can grow up with a lack of awareness of their own cognitive function, their NI cognitive function. It's going on, it's existing, but it's kind of existing almost unconsciously, because they haven't had it consciously acknowledged. And so it's kind of like it's half, it's like it's disconnected from, so it's like their main way of processing the world is dulled. And that in and of itself could look like depression on the outside. However, the FE kind of masks it. So if you imagine if you imagine the cognitive stack, the four functions, and you just half rub out NI, so it's like half being utilized, if you like. And especially in unhealthy family environments where that FE is exploited, getting the INFJ child to focus on the other person, to be in tune with what the narcissist parent wants, for instance, that FE is kind of overdeveloped, but it's not guarded by the NI to discern what is healthy and not, and so on and so forth. And so that FE can mask the depression, because often when the INFJ is with other people, they can be very engaging, very smiley, very animated in regards to their physical reaction to other people, in the sense of like their face often is often communicating that they're hearing, that they're there, and that they care. And so the INFJ's depression could be not seen by others because it's masked by the overdeveloped FE, overdeveloped essentially in an unhealthy way. But it can also be masked to the INFJ for the same reasons, especially when the INFJ grows up in an environment that kind of created the depression. In a sense, they're just being themselves, they're being normal, but it's really a result of a childhood that didn't value them on a deep level. Let's look at what happens then in adulthood. For some INFJs, they can end up becoming people pleasers, becoming codependent, and essentially disconnected from themselves and pleasing the world around them as a way to survive, which is just a mirroring, if you like, of childhood. And that can lead to other problems for the INFJ, in the sense that as the years go by and they're acting that out, they're not developing as optimally, or not developing as effectively as they could or would like to. And so as years go by, missed opportunities, poor relationship choices, poor career choices can just lead to an unfulfilled life, dissatisfaction, frustration, stress, anxiety, which all kind of can compound depression. It's like all of those things kind of lead, it's almost like a flow-on effect into a depressive state. So other things that the INFJ can exhibit is that they can be sort of lost in their own cognitions. So it's like they're stuck in their head, and sometimes people say, you know, INFJs are always in their head. But what I'm talking about is they're locked in their thinking. We could almost say, let's put it, locked in their TI, third function, and disconnected from their feelings. And to the level that feelings exist, is it's often blurred with the feelings and the needs of others. So there's I can never say this word particularly well, but it's like a lack of differentiation from other people. And so the INFJ can be sort of lost in their thinking, and it's disconnected from their feelings. And so they're trying to think their way through their problems, and they're essentially stuck there because the INFJ needs to get dropped back down into their feeling, into their own feelings, because they're often overly attuned to other people's feelings. Drop back into their own feelings, to feel them, to process them, to kind of regain an aspect of their selves. And part of that process is also reconnecting with their NI. For an INFJ that grows up in an environment that can lead them to be vulnerable to depression, in a sense, to the level that they weren't met in childhood, is possibly to the level that they're going to have problems in adulthood. And so that vulnerability to depression, or even carrying a depression from their childhood, can lead to all other sorts of problems in adulthood that kind of can compound that depression. Now, I want to inject some hope here, because it sounds hopeless, but the reality is, for a lot of INFJs, that this pathway, not that I think it's by design, but it tends to work out this way, that this particular kind of pathway is almost like a pathway towards self-actualization for the INFJ. It's like through crisis, through adversity, can come a deeper connection with self, and all the lessons that come out of that dysfunction and out of some of those challenges end up becoming sort of like jewels in the crown, going into the rest of their lives, both for themselves but also for people around them. So it's like a lot of INFJs can feel like a lot of their life has been wasted in dealing, like catching up to and dealing with what they didn't get growing up. For a lot of INFJs, that very journey is kind of building things into them that in a way wouldn't have otherwise, and those adversities and challenges and the overcoming of those challenges then become a gift for other people, to help others, whether that's in the cliche INFJ way in counselling, or just being there for others in a more general sense in their lives. So let's look at the remedy, or the remedies. Now, this whole video and everything I'm going to say after this it's not a formula necessarily. I think a lot of people could follow this general pathway that I'm describing, but it's not one size fits all. So for those watching, it's about seeing what resonates with you, seeing what fits, and taking that on and just leaving the rest. So for people that have had a childhood where there's been some unmet needs, and even to a more severe degree where there's been neglect and abuse, is essentially we need to go back there. And what I mean by that is it is about acknowledging the truth, because often, like I said before, when we grow up in it, we often don't know what we grew up in. All of our childhoods are normal until we've got something to compare it to. And so it's about kind of getting honest about one's childhood and looking at it more objectively, and sometimes that requires a conversation. It actually requires talking it out. But what I'm really just wanting to say here is it's about acknowledging the truth of what was or wasn't there in childhood. And it's through that acknowledgement that the healing can begin. Yes, it can require going to a doctor, maybe having, for those that depression might be severe, crippling, that it may require medication to like create a bit of a foundation to do the work of healing, so that hopefully medication is no longer needed going forward. Some people need that just because what the depression and the issues that they're dealing with are so chronic that that they need medical assistance to do the journey. Through getting honest and real about one's own childhood, it should reintroduce them to their feelings, and that's important for healing, because they're unresolved. Those feelings are unresolved, unacknowledged, not addressed, and so it's going reconnecting with those feelings. For a lot of people, which is not really characteristic of INFJs, but I think it exists for sure, or is anger. For a lot of people, for a lot of people who are struggling with depression, often have a lot of unresolved anger. And in fact, there's a term that is often very helpful, which is depression is anger turned inward. So, and that anger is a secondary emotion to a primary one. So you've got sort of two issues there. One is that when we're mistreated, it's natural to feel angry. In unhealthy childhood environments, a child will often be shamed or punished for being angry, and so that anger isn't able to be respected, if you like. And so that anger then gets swallowed, and that anger then turns on the self, and there's a lot of self-attack that goes on. And so getting back in touch with feelings can often reintroduce them to their anger, which is really important to feel, because it's the re-feeling of the anger that will lead to the more primary emotions that might be there. Might be sadness, rejection, hurt, abandonment, betrayal, all grief, all number of things. And it's the reconnection with that reality that leads to healing. Another remedy for depression is understanding it and understanding one's own story in childhood, putting it all in context, sort of putting the jigsaw puzzle together can help sort of normalize a person's experience. It's like it can reduce distress or anxiety, confusion when it's made sense, when a childhood and a person's whatever they might be going through in their lives is put in the context of what they grew up in. It can bring a certain level of relief in and of itself. Another part of it is reconnecting with Ni. But quickly backtracking to FE, part of healing is understanding where codependency might exist, where an overemphasis on the needs of others may exist, and beginning to address that, so the INFJ can get a more solid sense of self versus others, and learning to set boundaries about what I'm going to take on or what I'm not going to take on. And it's like that overgrown FE kind of moves back into a more healthy place within the self, and then coming up into Ni. And I think this work actually just naturally introduces an INFJ to their Ni, but being more deliberate is things like talking to other INFJs or other NFs as well, because it kind of has a natural affirming effect on the uniqueness and the self of the INFJ. Other NFs and INFJs can speak the same language and kind of affirm the processing, the way the INFJ processes, and that can be a way for the INFJ to kind of be reintroduced to their own process and start to recognize it more consciously, and be able to act on their NI knowings and intuition. Through that sort of process, an INFJ can then reorientate themselves in their relationships and if they're in a career or some kind of work, maybe reorientate their direction. So once they start to reconnect with themselves, they can put boundaries and continue to put boundaries in place in relationships and find other people that are maybe more healthy for them, or just improve the relationships that they have. And also maybe look at a career choice that might better fit the INFJ. Just want to also mention that the highly sensitive person, HSP, that there are INFJs that are also HSPs, and that essentially the way I look at that is that all that means is that everything that I've just said happens to the INFJ HSP at a much more intricate level. It's like the nerve endings of the INFJ are just super fine when there's that HSP part of them. So they experience everything more, you could say more sensitively or more profoundly, and it just has a bearing on, the HSP part of them has a bearing on how things affect them. So when that's the case, it can be helpful for an INFJ to get an understanding of of how the HSP side of things affects them in their own way, and that can also help them to better take care of themselves. One of the challenges that INFJs can have is that they feel that they need to conform to the culture that they're in, and often the culture actually doesn't support them. And so, but there's just this, you could call it the harmony preference, the NF side of them feels that they have to be harmonious and connect with the culture or be a part of it. But it often backfires. It often sort of costs more than they get from it. It's not that the INFJ can't be in culture. It's that the INFJ needs to be wise about how they do engage culture, where they position themselves, who they position themselves with, and the HSP side of things also can speak to that, so that the INFJ can recognize that they just need to do life and engage in life and culture and relationships in a way that works and fits for them, not in the ways in which it works for everybody else, because for the most part it's not going to work. And essentially these sorts of interventions, what they attempt to do is address the issues and the roots that lead to depression. Now, it could be for some people that even after doing this work and life improving to some extent or to a great extent, that there could be a lingering issue with it. It's kind of like if you get a piece of paper and you put a crease in it, that no matter how much you try and iron out that crease, you'll always see the crease. It will never be fully flat and invisible. You'll always see it. And it's possible that for some INFJs, there'll always be a vulnerability to it. It's like a hairline fracture there, that when life's not going too well, when life happens, so to speak, that's the way the INFJ could be impacted, and just that low mood, depressive type symptoms. That could be the reality for some INFJs, but certainly not for all. The ideal approach or the ideal outcome is that going into one's childhood, addressing any codependency, all the issues that I've put out in this video, should hopefully lead to a resolving of the depression. Again, other interventions may also be required for some people. If I was watching this, I would just take what works, what fits, and see this as just an angle on this whole area, and continue to do your own research and make sure it's like a holistic approach. Essentially, I think this video is a holistic approach, but yeah, I just don't want this video to be. It's not the answer to everybody's problems with depression. It's just a video on it. So maybe that's just a bit of a disclaimer. So like I said at the start of the video, if the video is resonating with you, I've got an INFJ playlist where I've featured a lot of videos on stress, on how to engage NI, how to recognize it, all sorts of different videos that might just be helpful for someone looking to move and grow in their own in their NI, and just as people. There's also a highly sensitive person video that I put out a year or two ago. Feel free to look at that. I'll put a link in this video. And a helpful video to demonstrate this mirroring effect is a video called the Still Face Experiment, and I'll leave some links to two videos that just look at what happens when a caregiver is being positive and loving towards a child, and when they choose to stop mirroring and engaging with the child, how it impacts a child. It can be a little upsetting to watch, so I'll just put that out there. It's sad, and for INFJs, they're going to feel it, but it can be just a helpful way to see the reality of what we can sometimes grow up in. To some it's a huge degree, to others it's just maybe a minor degree. So anyway, that's turned out to be quite a long video. If you've made it to the very end of this video, I appreciate the fact that you've obviously probably got a lot out of this, or that it's been of some help to you. Hit the like button if you like this video, and please share it if you feel that there's other groups or other people that you think might benefit from a video like this. Subscribe to the channel if you're resonating with the way that I approach things. And I will see you again soon in another video.